Well, this is a good indicator. In section 13, well, that gets us about halfway through the construction project. And you can see by these empty cards, we're making pretty good progress. And you should have a sense of accomplishment from that. So let's go over to the tailboat. The tail rotor drive system of your new Talon helicopter is shaft driven. We'll be installing a gearbox in the front, a gearbox in the rear. Also the tail rotor assembly, the tail rotor cable, and the drive system off the secondary. To help with this installation, we also have a tail boom mounted on the table without the skin on. So you'll be able to see the placement of the gearboxes, the shaft couplings, and the bearings. So we have a lot to do, so let's get started.
Refer to the Construction Manual, Section 13, for components and prints. Check the fit of the spline shafts into the couplings. They should fit smoothly without any binding. Locate the two gearboxes. Note, the rear gearbox is supplied with an alignment shaft to keep the internal parts aligned during shipping and assembly. Do not remove this shaft until you are ready to install the tail rotor shaft later in this section. Check the fit of the gearboxes in the tail boom bulkheads. This will be a tight fit, and you should be able to slide the gearbox flush with the bulkhead. If there is some binding, try and determine which stud is binding and slightly file that hole for a better fit. Use caution, as there should be very little filing required. This is an exploded view of the parts for the front portion of the tail rotor drive assembly. This is an exploded view of the parts for the middle portion of the tail rotor drive assembly. This is an exploded view of the parts for the rear portion of the tail rotor drive assembly. Install the spline shaft into the ends of the aluminum middle shaft. The spline shafts should extend equally from both ends. When set, the overall length with spline shafts installed must be 56 5/8 inches. There are two 1/4 inch bolts holding each spline shaft in position. Drill the bolt holes, maintaining the overall length at 56 5/8 inches. Each end should have two 1/4 inch holes, 1 3 inches from the end at 90 degrees apart. Note, throughout this installation, use a drill press and a V-block jig to ensure accurately drilled holes. After drilling, index the position and placement of each spline shaft and remove them from the aluminum middle shaft. Be sure and deburr all holes so the bearings will not be damaged when sliding them in position past the holes. Install the bearing and bearing flanges on the spline shaft, then reinstall it on the index end of the aluminum middle shaft. Do not install the bolts or set the lock rings at this time. Install the middle shaft into the tail boom by feeding the end with the bearing forward through the inspection hole at bulkhead number 2. Guide the shaft towards the rear of the tail boom. Now guide the opposite end through the bearing hole in the number 2 bulkhead towards the front. For clarity of installation, we will be installing the tail rotor shaft drive without the skin installed. Allow the shaft to extend through the front, then install the other spline shaft bearing and flanges. Position the shaft between the second and third bulkhead. With the bearing flanges on the front of both bulkheads, install the hardware. Install spline shaft bolts with 1/4-inch thin washers on the head and nut. The 1/4-inch nuts are torqued to 70 inch-pounds. Leave the bearing flange nuts snug at this time. The bearing flange should be torqued to 70 inch-pounds just before you set the lock rings later. The spline shaft should extend equally from the bearing on each end. The shaft can be adjusted forward or aft in the bearings to achieve equal distances before the lock rings are set. On each gearbox, you'll notice a bolt hole for the universal joint is pre-drilled in the shaft. The universal joint is also pre-drilled. These holes are slightly undersized and need to be opened to a 1/4 inch. Clamp the gearbox to the drill press and use a letter C bit to index the hole. Use a letter D bit to open the hole. Final size the hole with a 1/4 inch reamer. Remove the U-joint and deburr the holes. Check the fit and install the U-joint on the gearbox shaft and align the holes. Install the hardware on the gearbox shaft only. Slide each steel drive shaft into the appropriate universal joint. Note: the shorter shaft is the front shaft between bulkheads number 1 and 2. This is a snug fit and some shaft polishing may be necessary to allow for ease of assembly. The shaft should seat all the way into the U-joint. Note: this small hole should reveal the end of the shaft passing through. Do not drill the hole in the shaft at this time. You must check the fit of your tail boom first. Install the front gearbox on the bulkheads while carefully engaging the spine couplings. Before installing the rear gearbox, check the fit of the pre-drilled holes and install the cable stop bracket on the 4th bulkhead. Use 2 3/16-inch bolts, washers, and nuts to secure the bulkhead. Install the rear gearbox. When installed, neither the front or the rear shafts must not be bottomed in the spline couplings. Both spline couplings should engage the splines an equal amount with approximately 1/8 inch fore-aft play. To check this, secure each gearbox with at least 2 nuts each. With the bearing lock rings free, carefully move the middle shaft fore and aft. Note the total end play. The center shaft can be repositioned if needed by sliding it fore and aft in the bearings. If you do not have enough end play or the shaft is bottomed out, trimming either front and/or rear shaft ends is acceptable. When the correct position is found, set the lock rings in the direction of rotation of the shaft, clockwise looking aft, and tighten the screws. Do not use Loctite on these bearings. Remove the gearboxes and the shafts from the tail boom. Determine the hole location with the U-joint in place. Make sure the shaft is seated all the way into the U-joint. Use a V-block on the drill press and drill the holes in the shaft with a pilot drill. Open that hole with a letter D drill. The U-joint needs to be removed from the gearboxes for this step. Reposition the V-block and index the hole with the letter C bit. Final size the hole with a 1/4 inch reamer with the U-joint in place. Install the grease fittings on the spline couplings. Reinstall the rear gearbox. Install the nuts and washers. Reinstall the front gearbox on the first bulkhead. Install the tail rotor drive pulley on the secondary. Use a coating of anti-seize in the inside of the pulley to prevent galling on the shaft. Place the pulley on the input shaft on the gearbox. Using a straight edge, align the pulley vertically with the tail rotor drive pulley on the secondary assembly. Note: you may have to modify a straight edge between the secondary and the tail rotor drive pulley. The pulley must be parallel. If not, add a shim between the front gearbox and the bulkhead. The shim should cover the entire width of the gearbox. Once the pulley is at the right height and parallel with the secondary pulley, mark the location of the pulley on the shaft. This is a shim made for the lower mounting studs of the front gearbox. Note: if required to add a shim at the bottom, you may need to remove and reinstall the 2 lower studs on the gearbox. Measure the length of the studs. Remove and clean the threads to remove the old thread locker. Install with new Loctite 242 and thread into the gearbox all the way and then back out enough to allow for thickness of your shim. The proper length must allow for a washer, nut, and at least 1 thread past the lock nut. Remove the gearbox and you must use a drill press and V-block to drill these holes. This hole must be final sized with a letter D bit and a letter D reamer. Install the pulley and hardware and torque the bolt. Note: the final installation of the secondary pulley is not until after the cooling system is fitted. With the front gearbox loose, install the drive belt on the two pulleys. Do not force the belt over the edge of the pulleys. Now secure the front gearbox with the hardware. Here is an exploded view of the tensioner assembly. Note, before assembly, pass a 5/16" reamer through the idler pivot bracket. Assemble the tensioner pulley to the arm and install it on the airframe. Use caution not to damage the belt when lifting it over the pulley and bolt head to engage the spring. On your final assembly, apply grease to the bolt and mating parts. Vertical adjustment can be achieved by shimming the upper pulley spacer. The belt should have a tension of 1/2 inches of deflection with 7 pounds of pressure. The tensioner pulley spring applies pressure against the back of the belt. To set the static tension and to limit the travel in the opposite direction, install the tensioner arm stop. The stop position must be set at the minimum tension, which is 1/2 inches of deflection with 7 pounds of pressure. Find that stop, then drill a hole in the stop and install the stop, bolt, nut, and washers to the idler bracket. Use template 17-1 and make the two tail rotor pitch actuator arms. After cutting and drilling, bend the arms at the bend lines to create a joggle about 3/4 of an inch, bending each arm out. Be sure to use a piece of angle aluminum in the vise jaws to protect the aluminum arms when bending. The tail boom skin will need to be removed to allow clearance for the actuator arms. Remove no more than necessary. The opening should center on the tail rotor shaft. The opening will be approximately 2 3/8 inches high and about 3 inches long. In addition, you will need to trim a small portion of the stringers for clearance of the actuator arms. Here is the tail rotor cable secured to the cable mount and actuator arms outside the tail boom for clarity. Two 3/16" bolts secure the tail cable and spacers to the actuator arms. You will need to drill the head of each bolt for a safety wire hole. Use a drill bolt head jig to do this task. Before installing the gearbox, check the fit and full range of the actuator arms. Install the actuator arm bracket on the 5th bulkhead using the 2 studs of the gearbox. Secure the upper spacer and 3/16" bolt to the actuator arm. This bolt must be safety wired on your final install. Install the upper arm first as shown. Grease the pivot bolt and mating surfaces. Install the lower actuator arms hardware. On your final assembly, you will need to drill a hole in the shank of the pivot bolt to secure the castellated nut with cotter pin. Do that with a bolt shank jig as shown. If you haven't already done so, install the cable stop bracket on the fourth bulkhead. Install the tail rotor cable in the tail boom. When routing the cable, start at the tail end and work forward. This way you can pull the slack out of the tail boom and leave it in the tub. Run the cable under the horizontal fin spar along the bottom of the tail boom. Use plastic wire ties to attach it to the bulkheads. Moving forward, attach the cable along the left of the ballast weight weldment. As the cable leaves the boom, route it under the cross brace and lower tail boom mount tube. This will avoid a tight radius area. Then run it along the outside of the tail boom support tube pilot side, above the rear landing gear and under the fuel tank bracket. The cable will last longer if it is not tied in a tight radius anywhere along the cable path. Connect the actuator arms using the female rod end and actuator arm spacers as shown. Drill holes in the head of the bolts to allow bolts to be safety wired on your final install. Remove the plastic from the blades and fit the end caps. It may be necessary to bend the caps slightly to achieve a good fit. Drill 4 number 40 rivet holes in each side of each blade. Note, at this time do not install the pop rivets until after balancing the blades. The cap does not need to fit perfectly to the airfoil of the blades. Countersink just enough to make the head of the pop rivet flush with the airfoil. Do not countersink too far or the pop rivet will not hold the end caps. Builder tooltip. Use a mini micro stop with a number 40 countersink makes this countersink task accurate and easy. Note, drill a 3/16 inch hole in the middle of each end cap so that the grease thrown out by centrifugal force during operation will not build up inside the blade. Locate the following components. Install the tail rotor barrel on the shaft. Then install the snap rings with numbers or flat side facing the shaft. You will need a snap ring tool that has extended tips and always wear safety glasses. Installation must be done with the correct tool to prevent damage to the rings or barrel. Recommended pliers are Millbar 4450, New Britain P67, and KD 445. The opening in the snap ring should be in line with the shaft. Exploded view of the next assembly. Mount the rubber O-rings on the pitch pins. Grease the pitch pins, thrust bearings, and alignment bearings and assemble as shown on print E17-2001. Tail rotor details. Install the pitch pin assembly into the tail rotor barrel. Install the outer snap rings with the flat side out and with the openings perpendicular to the tail rotor shaft and 180 degrees to each other. Install the grease fittings. Install the bearings and 3/8-inch pivot bolt. Normally, a light tap will help seat the bearing. Do not torque this bolt. It should just be tight enough to turn with a wrench. Position the pitch horns on the blade spars. Install the blades and pitch horns on the pitch pins. Use a pick-awl to help with hole alignment. Before installing the 3/16-inch bolts, you may need to carefully pass a 3/16-inch reamer through the holes to final size the hole. A light tap is okay. Now you will need to check the static balance of the tail rotor blades. You can do this by building a fixture with a vise, a piece of 2x4 wood, and 2 pieces of 50 thousandths aluminum sheet stock. The edges must be level in all directions. Use small pieces of foam to wedge the tail rotor blades as shown. This helps keep the tail rotor barrel 90 degrees to the shaft while balancing. Use the bearings and pulleys from the fan countershaft as a counterbalance while on the fixture. For best results, extend the blades as far away from the edge of the aluminum fixture as the counterbalance will allow. If weight is needed for horizontal balance, add it to the inside of the airfoil at the tip. Use rivets for weight. Note: the blades must be forced out against the thrust bearings so that they will be in the same position as if forced out by centrifugal force when in flight.